In the year 2015, a 29-year-old man named Johnny Coxey and his 25-year-old wife, Megan Coxey, were living in a very low-income section of Spartanburg, South Carolina. Johnny and Megan were in a really tough spot. They both struggled mightily with drug addiction, making it nearly impossible to hold down steady work. Because they did not have any steady income, they often found themselves out on the streets, begging people for spare change just to buy their next meal. Their heavy drug use also made it nearly impossible for them to be good parents to their only child. In fact, in December of that year, things got so bad that Child Protective Services had to step in and officially take their child away from them. And if that was not already bad enough, almost immediately after their child was taken, both Megan and Johnny were arrested and thrown in jail for various offenses that were directly connected to their drug habits. So, Johnny and Megan were at absolute rock bottom at this point. They were sitting inside cold jail cells, feeling hopeless and wondering how they were ever going to put their lives back together. But they were about to get what seemed like a major break. After they got out of jail, which was only after a couple of days, Megan was contacted by a very successful local real estate agent named Todd Kapp. Now, Todd was someone she had met previously when she used to work as a waitress at a local diner in town. Todd had been a regular customer there, and they had struck up casual conversations in the past. Todd was reaching out to her to make an offer that seemed almost too good to be true. He wanted to offer Megan and her husband pretty decent paying jobs. Todd explained that he had recently purchased a massive 95-acre plot of land in the area, and he needed people to come out to the property and help him clean it up. He needed them to clear out the thick brush and clean up some of the old buildings that were scattered across the land. Todd's plan was to develop this property further in the future, and he had been reaching out to other people in Spartanburg to see if they wanted to earn some quick cash. Megan and Johnny were two of the people he decided to contact. Of course, Megan and Johnny immediately said yes. They were in desperate need of cash, and paying jobs did not come around very often. On December 19th of that year, Megan spoke to her mother on the phone and excitedly told her about this new job opportunity. She told her mother exactly where the property was and what she and Johnny would be doing. After that call, she and Johnny packed up a few things and made their way out to the property. When they arrived, they saw a massive chain-link fence wrapped around what looked like a giant dense forest. This forest was the 95-acre plot of land that Todd owned. Somewhere near the center of this dense forest were a few buildings that Johnny and Megan were supposed to clean. The couple drove along the fence line until they finally found the break in the fence. That break led directly to a dirt access road. They turned onto the road and began driving deep into the heart of this dark, thick forest. 3 days later, Megan's mother tried to get in touch with her, but she could not get through. When she tried to call Johnny, she could not reach him either. Both of their phones went straight to voicemail. Given the couple's history with drugs, Megan's mother immediately feared the worst. She thought that maybe they had gotten paid, used the money to buy drugs, and then tragically overdosed somewhere. In a panic, she rushed over to Megan and Johnny's house to check on them, but they were not there. At this point, something in her gut told her that something was seriously wrong. It was absolutely not common for them to go completely off the grid like this, so she immediately called the police and reported them missing. The police began their investigation by speaking to Todd Kapp. Since Todd was the owner of the property and the person who hired them, he was presumably one of the last people to see them before they went missing. But when the officers spoke to Todd, he was very calm and cooperative. He told them that he had very limited interaction with the couple. He said they came out to his property, cleaned up 2 of his buildings, and then he paid them in cash and they left. He claimed they had not had any contact since then and that he had absolutely no clue where they would have gone. At this point, the police decided their best bet was just to wait and see what happened. The police had a running suspicion that the couple used the money from cleaning up the property to buy drugs and went on a binge. They figured the couple would either turn up in a few days when the drugs ran out, or they would be found dead somewhere from an overdose. But a couple of days went by and the couple did not reemerge. A couple of weeks went by and then a couple of months went by. It was not long before the investigation completely stalled and the case went cold. But the case would not stay cold for very long. On August 31st, 2016, which was roughly 8 months after the Coxies were reported missing, 2 more residents of Spartanburg went missing as well. They were 30-year-old Caleb Brown, who also went by the name Kayla, and her boyfriend, 32-year-old Charlie Carver. The pair had only been dating for about a month, but they were already becoming quite serious. Charlie had already introduced Kayla to his family, a step that Charlie's father later said was a very big deal for his son. Unlike the Coxies, Kayla and Charlie were not struggling with drug addiction or financial issues. They were actually pretty well off. Charlie worked full-time operating a printer at a local business, and Kayla made a living by doing various odd jobs around town. According to their families, the couple was very happy with their lives and the direction they were going. But starting on the evening of August 31st, Kayla and Charlie stopped returning text messages and answering phone calls. Charlie's father was especially close with Charlie, so this sudden silence was immediately noticed by him. But at first, he tried to rule out any bad thoughts. He thought to himself that there was probably a reasonable explanation for why his son was not texting him back, and that he would hear from him over the next couple of days. But over the next couple of days, Charlie continued not to answer any text messages or pick up any phone calls, and the same was true for Kayla. After 48 hours of this total silence, Charlie's father finally hopped in his car and drove over to his son's house to see if he was there, but he was not. He then drove over to Kayla's place, and she was not there either. None of this made any sense, so he called the police and reported them missing. The police started their investigation with absolutely no leads. To begin, they decided to interview everyone in Charlie and Kayla's lives, including friends, family, acquaintances, employers, and coworkers, but nobody had any idea where the couple had gone. They had not told anyone about any trip they were going on, and they had not mentioned doing anything unusual. It seemed like they had just vanished. Initially, this investigation got nowhere. But 2 months after they were reported missing, the police finally obtained a search warrant that allowed them to look at their cell phone records. When they looked at Kayla's cell phone records, they were able to triangulate roughly where her last known location was, according to the signals her cell phone was sending off to nearby cell phone towers. And when they got the results, they discovered that her last known location was inside the exact same 95-acre plot of land that the Coxies had been in before they went missing. Immediately, the police put in a request for an emergency search warrant to go search this 95-acre property. They sent a team of officers out to the property, and they actually set up outside that big chain link fence and just waited for the search warrant to clear. At the exact same time, another group of police officers went to Todd Kapp's house, which was actually in town about 20 minutes away from this property, to talk to him about why in the world Kayla's cell phone would be pinging inside of his land. When the police arrived at his front doorstep, Todd was obviously caught off guard by suddenly having all these officers at his home. He understood very quickly how unbelievably suspicious it looked that now 2 different couples had gone onto his property right before they vanished. He looked at the officers and told them that he knew how this looked, but he insisted he had nothing to hide. He told them that he did hire Kayla and her boyfriend had come along with her. He said they went on his property, did some work for him, cleared some brush, and then he paid them and they left. He claimed that was the last he saw of them and that he had no idea why her phone would still be on his property. At the same time that the team of officers was grilling Todd at his house, the other team, waiting outside the 95-acre property, found out that their search warrant had been officially granted. They wasted no time. They flew through the gate, got onto the dirt access road, and began driving fast into this huge forest. As they were driving, they pulled out the maps they had printed, which showed the rough estimation of where Kayla's final cell phone signal was located. It looked like the last spot was inside a clearing. As they drove down the access road through all the thick trees, they saw a clearing up ahead, and it looked very much like the clearing on their map. When they pulled into the clearing, they saw two green buildings off to the left side of the road. The building on the left was like a shed, the kind of place where you might keep yard tools like lawnmowers, shovels, and rakes. But right next to it, on the right, was a large metal shipping container. It had heavy metal chains wrapped around it, and there were 5 heavy padlocks keeping it shut. The police immediately thought that Kayla might be inside one of these buildings, as this was likely where her last cell phone ping had come from. Right away, they went inside the wooden building on the left because it was much easier to get into since there were no padlocks on it. But when they got inside, they found nothing of note. Kayla was not in there, Charlie was not in there, and there was no cell phone. It was just a regular shed filled with gardening tools. So they went over to the metal shipping container on the right. They got out their metal cutting power saws and their bolt cutters and began cutting through all the chains and padlocks. When they finally managed to get the heavy door open, they were absolutely astounded by what they saw inside. Inside the dark metal shipping container, the police discovered Kayla. She was in extremely rough shape. She had a thick metal chain wrapped around her neck, and that chain was anchored directly to the wall of the shipping container. She was also handcuffed, but she was alive. The officers rushed inside to help her. They told her to stay calm and that they were going to get her out of there. One officer asked her what her name was, and she told them her name was Kayla. They quickly used their cutters to free her from the chains and carried her out to the waiting paramedics. After they got her out of the shipping container and got her stabilized, Kayla told the police the terrifying story of what had happened to her. She said that back on August 31st, 2016, she had been contacted by Todd Kapp, who told her that he was still looking for people to come out and help clean up his property because he was getting ready to develop it. Kayla was looking for work, so she agreed to do it. After getting the job, Kayla told her boyfriend, Charlie, about it. Charlie was a very supportive boyfriend, and he told her that he would tag along to help her do the job. He said he would not even ask Todd for any money, and that he just wanted to help her out. Kayla was thrilled, and later that day, they made their way out to the 95-acre property. They reached the chain-link fence, found the break, hopped onto the access road, and drove deep into the forest. After driving for several minutes, they reached the clearing. They saw Todd standing up ahead on the left, smiling and waving at them right in front of the wooden shed and the metal shipping container. Charlie parked the car directly in front of Todd. He and Kayla got out of the car and walked up to Todd to see what he wanted them to do. But as soon as they were standing in front of him, Todd casually pulled out a gun and shot Charlie 3 times in the chest. As soon as Charlie fell to the ground, Todd pointed the gun at Kayla and told her that if she tried to run, he would kill her and he would kill her family. Todd then put the gun away, walked over to Charlie, wrapped his body in a blue tarp, and carried him over to a nearby tractor, dumping his body inside the front bucket. Todd then walked back over to Kayla, who was so terrified she could not even move. He drew his gun again and ordered her to go inside the shipping container. He locked her inside, and for 65 days, she remained his prisoner in the dark. Over the course of those 65 days, Todd would come down to the property once or twice a day and do whatever he wanted with her. He warned her that if she ever tried to resist or fight back, he would kill her and her family. Because of this, Kayla decided very early on that she would not put up a fight. She chose to comply in order to protect her family, fully expecting that Todd would eventually grow tired of her and kill her anyway. She truly did not believe she would ever be rescued. After Kayla finished telling the officers this horrifying story, they immediately radioed the other team of police officers who were still at Todd Kapp's house. They told them everything Kayla had said. The confrontation and Todd's arrest were captured on police video. The officers confronted Todd, telling him that they had found Kayla locked in a container on his property and that she had accused him of shooting Charlie and burying his body. At first, Todd denied everything, claiming he had nothing to do with it and that he did not lock anyone up. but the police arrested him on the spot and put him in the back of a patrol car. Even though Todd initially denied any wrongdoing, he eventually confessed. He admitted to killing Charlie and kidnapping Kayla, but then he went even further. He confessed to killing Johnny and Megan Coxey as well. He told the investigators that he had lured the Coxeys onto his property using the exact same promise of work. When they reached the buildings in the clearing, he drew his gun and shot Johnny, killing him instantly. He then ordered Megan to go inside the shipping container. But unlike Kayla, Megan refused to comply. She fought back with everything she had and was completely resistant to him. This made Todd furious. After only 5 days of keeping her locked up, he decided to kill her. He casually described her to police by saying that she was acting like a wild animal, so he had to put a bullet in the back of her head. He had absolutely no remorse for what he had done to them. The police would later search the property and find the bodies of Charlie, Johnny, and Megan buried in shallow graves right outside the shipping container. Knowing that he was facing multiple charges of first-degree murder, Todd realized he was highly likely to face the death penalty. He wanted to avoid execution, so he made a deal with the prosecutors. He told them that if they agreed to take the death penalty off the table, he would confess to even more murders that the police had never solved. The police and prosecutors agreed to the deal, and Todd began to speak. He confessed that back in 2003, he had walked into a local motorbike shop in Spartanburg and gunned down 4 staff members. The reason he did it was incredibly petty. Todd explained that a few days before the shooting, he had gone into the shop and the employees had made a snide remark about how he was bad at riding motorcycles. It was meant to be a harmless joke, but Todd took it as a massive personal insult. He could not let it go. So, in broad daylight, he went back to the shop with a gun and shot all 4 employees. After they fell, he walked up to each one of them and fired an extra bullet into their heads to make sure they were dead. As Todd told the story, he was completely casual and even laughed about it. He bragged to the detectives, telling them they should be proud of how quickly he cleared the shop, as if they would appreciate his efficiency. These 4 murders were the only additional ones Todd officially confessed to, which was enough to spare him from the death penalty. But investigators believe his actual victim count is much higher. While Kayla was held captive in the shipping container, Todd had bragged to her that his actual body count was in the high 2 digits. He likely told her this because he never expected her to leave that shipping container alive. But because she survived, his secrets were finally exposed to the world. After Todd's arrest, the details of his life began to emerge, and one of the most disturbing discoveries involved his online activity. Someone discovered that Todd had an anonymous Amazon account where he regularly posted product reviews. The items he reviewed were highly specific tools like knives, shovels, chainsaws, and padlocks. But it was the content of his reviews that was truly bone-chilling. Todd had written detailed reviews about how he planned to use these tools to kill people, or how he had already used them to dispose of bodies. In one review for a set of heavy-duty padlocks, he wrote that he had 5 of them on a shipping container, and he noted that it was just like the song Hotel California. Hotel California, the famous song by the Eagles, has a well-known line that says you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. It was a terrifying glimpse into the mind of a monster who was actively bragging about his crimes online while his victims were trapped on his property. Ultimately, Todd Kapp was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will spend the remainder of his days locked away in a maximum security prison, unable to ever hurt anyone else. But for the families of Johnny and Megan Coxey and Charlie Carver, the pain of their loss will never truly go away. And for Kayla, the trauma of those 65 days in the dark will remain with her forever. The unanswered questions about how many other victims might still be out there in those woods continue to haunt the community to this day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Somewhere deep in a forest in France, a girl began to realize something was wrong. At first, it was just the sound of a bell ringing somewhere between the trees, and every time she stopped to listen, it would disappear like it was never there at all. But the deeper she went into the forest, the more certain she became of one thing. Something was there with her just out of sight. In June of 2019, an 18-year-old girl named Bella was finishing up her first year of college. She was excited to head home for the summer. Her family lived on the outskirts of a small town in France, a place tucked away in the mountains and almost completely surrounded by a massive, dense forest. Growing up there, Bella had spent a huge amount of her childhood exploring that forest. Sometimes she would go by herself, other times with her father, or maybe with her cousins. Over the years, she had come to know the woods like the back of her hand. She knew every trail, every landmark, every quiet little spot. Her absolute favorite place in this entire forest was a small, man-made lake that was situated deep inside, almost at the very center of the woods. It wasn't a very large lake, but the view was breathtaking and it was always incredibly peaceful. It was her go-to spot to clear her head. Getting there was a little ritual she had perfected over the years. She would leave her house, get into her small car, and drive for a couple of miles down a quiet country road. At a very specific, unmarked spot, she would pull over onto the gravel shoulder. There were no signs, no designated parking area. It was just a place she and her family had discovered, a hidden gateway to their part of the forest. After parking, she'd get out, and instead of walking along the road, she would turn and walk directly into the line of trees that grew right up against the shoulder. The underbrush was thick for the first few feet, but it quickly opened up into a small clearing. Just ahead, she would see a little stream trickling through the woods. To the left of this stream, there was what looked like a worn-out footpath, but it wasn't a human trail. It was an animal trail, a path carved out over years and years by deer and other wildlife making their way through the forest. Bella would walk down to this animal path and follow it as it ran parallel to the stream. She'd walk for about 15 or 20 minutes, just enjoying the quiet sounds of nature until the path took a sharp turn to the left, heading away from the water. At that point, Bella would leave the animal trail behind. She'd continue walking straight, following the stream north, deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. This part of the journey involved stepping carefully on mossy rocks in the stream and walking along the muddy banks on either side. It was a slower pace, and it would take her about an hour of steady walking before the stream eventually met up with a much larger river that ran from east to west. When she reached this river, Bella would turn left, heading west, and follow the riverbank for another 20 minutes or so. And then, finally, the river would open up and feed directly into her destination, the man-made lake. She would find a comfortable rock to sit on, watch the animals, listen to the wind in the trees, and just feel totally at peace. To get back, she would just retrace her steps exactly. The whole trip, one way, from her car to the lake, took about 2 hours. A big part of why Bella loved this place so much was because it felt like it belonged to her and her family. In all her years of coming out here, the only other people she had ever seen in this part of the forest or anywhere near the lake were members of her own family. It was their secret, their private sanctuary. So, in June of that year, when Bella finally came home from college, one of the first things she wanted to do was go out to the lake. She hadn't been in months because of school, and she was really missing her happy place. One morning, she got up early, told her parents where she was headed, and set out by herself. She got in her car, drove the familiar couple of miles, and pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. She got out, turned away from the road, and walked into the forest. She found the stream, then the animal path beside it. She walked for a few minutes until the trail cut to the left, and just as she always did, she stayed with the stream, continuing her journey north. About 30 minutes later, when she was still a good mile or two away from the east-west river, she heard something. It was a bell. Somewhere off in the distance, far ahead of her, she heard a single, clear chime. As soon as she heard it, she stopped dead in her tracks. That was wrong. There were never any people out here. Ever. And that sound, a bell, had to come from a person or something a person had made. She stood perfectly still, listening, wondering if she had imagined it. It could have just been a strange sound, her mind playing tricks on her in the silence of the woods. She waited. And then she heard it again. But this time, it wasn't a single chime. The bell started ringing continuously. It wasn't a steady, rhythmic ringing, though. It was sporadic and uneven, almost frantic, like someone holding a bell and just shaking it randomly at a sports game. Her mind started racing, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe a dog had gotten lost out here and it had a bell on its collar. But as she listened, she realized the sound was too loud, too resonant. It wasn't the tiny jingle of a pet's bell. This was something bigger, more substantial. She thought of other, stranger possibilities. Maybe someone had a bell in a box, and the box fell into the river upstream and was now floating down, hitting rocks and causing the sound. She was coming up with all these weird scenarios, but honestly, she wasn't scared. She was just incredibly curious. Since the sound of the bell seemed to be coming from the direction she was already heading, she decided to just keep walking. She wanted to see for herself what was making that noise. So Bella started walking along the stream again, her ears tuned to the constant random ringing up ahead. She was completely focused on it, trying to pinpoint its exact location. And then, after about 5 more minutes of walking, the bell just stopped. It went completely silent. The sudden absence of the sound was actually more startling than the sound itself. She stopped again, listening intently, expecting it to start up again, but it didn't. All she could hear now were the normal sounds of the forest, the stream, the birds, the wind. Bella had no explanation for the bell or why it had stopped, but she wasn't really worried about it. She figured there had to be a logical explanation for it, even if she couldn't think of one. So she just shrugged it off, put her focus back on her hike, and kept walking toward the lake. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Bella was still making her way along the stream. She was getting closer to the East-West River, maybe only a half-mile away now. That's when she saw something up ahead on the left bank of the stream. It was a dark lump on the ground. At first, she couldn't tell what it was. It could have been a strangely shaped rock or maybe an animal. As she got closer, she realized it was a beaver lying motionless on the ground, and this beaver was missing its head. Now, this was a huge forest, and Bella knew perfectly well that it was full of wild animals. Finding the body of an animal that had been killed by a predator wasn't unusual. That was just nature. But as she stood over it, something struck her as deeply wrong. The cut on the beaver's neck was incredibly neat and uniform. It looked like its head had been very carefully removed with an extremely sharp knife. And the beaver's head was nowhere in sight. This definitely didn't look like the work of a predator. The teeth and claws of an animal would have left a ragged, torn mess. Also, the rest of the beaver's body was completely untouched. Whatever had killed it clearly wasn't interested in eating it. As Bella stood there staring down at the bizarre sight, she also noticed there was no smell. Usually, when an animal dies, the process of decomposition starts quickly and it creates a very distinct odor. The lack of any smell told Bella that this beaver must have been killed very, very recently. Then she gently nudged the body with the toe of her shoe and saw that it was still fairly limp. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body that happens shortly after death, hadn't set in yet. As all these facts clicked into place in her mind, a cold realization washed over her. This beaver had died only a short time ago, which meant that whoever or whatever had killed it was probably still somewhere nearby. And then Bella couldn't help but connect the dead beaver to the bell she had heard earlier. Before, the bell was just a curiosity. But now, considering the sound had come from this same general area where this freshly killed and decapitated beaver was now lying, it made her deeply uneasy. Her head snapped up, and she found herself frantically scanning the trees, her eyes darting in every direction. She was looking for a person, maybe a hunter, someone who could explain what was going on. But she saw nothing. There was no movement, no sound, just the dense, silent woods. She felt a wave of panic begin to rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stop. She took a deep breath and told herself to calm down. It was broad daylight. She had been coming to these woods her entire life and had never seen another person, never had a dangerous encounter with an animal. She was sure everything was fine. She had to be overreacting. She had nothing to worry about. So she took another deep breath, carefully stepped over the beaver's body, and kept on walking. Eventually, Bella reached the East-West River. She made the left turn and walked the final 20 minutes along its bank until she reached the man-made lake. She sat for a while, enjoying the beautiful view and the familiar scenery, trying to push the image of the beaver out of her mind. After some time, she got up, turned around, and began the long walk back. She passed the spot where the beaver was still lying on the ground, walked all the way back to her car, and went home, feeling a little unsettled, but mostly okay. A week went by. Bella was at home feeling bored and restless. On an impulse, she decided that the only cure for her boredom was a trip back to the place she loved most, the man-made lake. She told her parents where she was going, and then she left the house. It was already 6 in the evening when she got in her car, drove to the pull-off, parked, and entered the woods. Sunset that night was at 9, so Bella knew she couldn't linger. This would have to be a quick trip if she wanted to avoid being caught in the forest after dark. She found the animal trail and started her journey along the stream. She followed it until the trail veered left, and then she continued along the stream bed. As she was walking, she started to hear the distant rumble of thunder. She looked up through the canopy of leaves and could see the sky was growing dark, much darker than it should be. It was still a couple of hours before sunset, so she knew a storm was rolling in. But Bella was determined. She was not going to turn back. She wanted to get to that lake. So instead of heading back to her car, she did the opposite. She started jogging along the stream, trying to get there as fast as she possibly could. Almost as soon as she picked up her pace, the first raindrops began to fall. By the time she passed the spot where the beaver corpse had been lying on the ground, it hadn't moved, the rain was really coming down. About 15 minutes after she passed the corpse, she finally reached the East-West River. By this point, the rain had turned into a full-blown downpour. Still, Bella was resolute. She turned left at the river and continued west, intending to go all the way to the lake. But after only a minute or two of walking along the river, with about 20 minutes still left to go, she stopped herself. She looked at her watch and saw that it was already after 8 o'clock. She started thinking it through logically. If she turned around right now, it would still take her over an hour to get back to her car. Sunset was at 9. It was already past 8. That meant, best case scenario, she was going to have to navigate the last part of her journey in the dark. And if she went all the way to the lake first, then she would be walking in the pitch-black forest for maybe up to an hour. She was confident she could probably do it, but it was also pouring rain and she was cold and soaked. If she got lost or twisted an ankle, this could turn into a very bad situation very quickly. So, as much as she wanted to keep going, she made the sensible decision. She needed to turn around and head back. She turned and began walking back along the East-West River toward the spot where the stream fed into it. She turned south and started making her way along the stream back toward her car. Because it was getting so dark and the rain was so heavy, visibility was terrible. She kept her head down, watching the ground, trying not to trip. She was carefully placing her feet on rocks and muddy patches, making sure her footing was solid. The rain was pounding all around her. She had been walking like this for about 15 minutes when, all of a sudden, something hit her hard on the top of her head. Reflexively, she cried out and looked up, throwing her hands in front of her face to protect herself. And then she saw what she had just run into. It was the beaver corpse. It was hanging from a string, dangling from a tree branch directly over the path. And its head, which had been missing before, had been found. It had been crudely stitched onto the beaver's own front paws. So she was looking at this grotesque dangling puppet of a beaver carrying its own head, and she had walked right into it. Her first reaction was to gag. She felt like she was going to vomit right there. She was so disgusted. Then she started frantically rubbing at her hair where the wet, decomposing thing had touched her, terrified that some fluid from it had gotten on her. After a moment of panicked scrubbing, she stopped. And something truly terrifying dawned on her. Whoever had strung this beaver up in this tree and had taken the time to stitch its head onto its paws had done it in the last 30 minutes. Because just 30 minutes earlier, on her way in, she specifically remembered seeing the beaver carcass on the ground. She saw it. It was in the same spot it had been a week ago. And now, here it was, hanging from a tree. As the wheels turned in her head, Bella came to a chilling conclusion. If someone had just done this, then that someone was probably still here. They were probably nearby. At this point, it was getting really dark. The rain was hammering down, and she felt completely exposed. She started whipping her head around, trying to peer through the downpour into the dark woods, searching for anyone who might have done this. But all she could see was the dark, blurry shape of the forest in every direction. She knew she was at least an hour away from her car, even if she ran. Suddenly, she was totally and completely panicked. In a desperate effort to calm herself down, she whispered to herself, "Okay, I need to get out of here, but I have to walk. If I start running, I'll fall, I'll get lost, this will turn into a nightmare. Just walk. Try to walk." So she took a shaky breath, walked around the dangling beaver corpse, and started moving along the stream again. But as soon as she was past it, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She could hear movement behind her. A rustling sound. She didn't know what it was. It could have been a deer, just some animal startled by the storm. But she was far too afraid to turn around and look. And even though she was telling herself to stay calm, to just keep walking, that she was safe and just freaking herself out, she could feel her pace quickening. Her walk turned into a jog, and then finally she broke into a full-on sprint, running down the stream away from that beaver and whatever was moving in the trees behind her. At some point, maybe 5 or 6 minutes after seeing the beaver, she was so out of breath from sprinting that she had to slow down to a walk. As soon as she slowed down, still without turning around, she heard it again. The sound of that bell. It was the exact same sound she had heard the week before, that constant, sporadic ringing. But in her panic state, she couldn't tell where it was coming from. Her anxiety was so high, her heart was pounding so loud, she didn't know if it was behind her, or to the side, or all around her. It was now completely dark, and she was full-blown terrified. There was someone or something behind her, the person who had strung up that beaver, and they were probably watching her right now. Even though she was beyond exhausted and could barely breathe, she started sprinting again as fast as her legs would carry her. She stumbled and fell on the slippery rocks. She tripped over roots, not even looking where she was going anymore. And in the background, all around her, she could hear that bell chiming, and she could hear something crashing through the woods behind her. She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out her iPhone. As she was running, she managed to dial her father. She pressed the phone to her ear, crying, panting, gasping for air. Her father picked up, and she was so relieved to hear his voice, but she couldn't even form a sentence. She just started wailing, pleading with him. Dad, come out to the forest. Meet me at the spot where the trail veers away from the stream. Meet me there. There's someone in the forest. They're chasing me, and I can't see them. Her father, on the other end of the line, didn't know what to make of it, but he could hear the pure primal fear in his daughter's voice. He didn't waste time with questions. He just said, "Stay on the line. I'm coming to meet you right now." Bella's father and mother, with Bella still on the phone with them, ran out of their house. They jumped in their car and sped the couple of miles down the road. They parked next to their daughter's car, and as they were getting out, they could hear it. Way off in the woods, they could hear the faint sound of the bell. They could hear their daughter screaming on the phone, and they could hear that same bell sound coming through the phone's speaker. She was begging them, "Please, come into the woods, come in here, save me." Her parents ran into the woods and started charging up the stream. Meanwhile, Bella was still deep in the forest, still 10 or 15 minutes away from them. She could barely run anymore. She had used up almost all of her energy. And as she got closer and closer to where her parents would be, the sporadic ringing of the bell was getting louder and louder and louder. Whatever it was gaining on her. She could hear sticks and branches snapping right behind her, as if something was just feet away. Finally, when it felt like the bell was ringing right behind her head, she just stopped. It was a moment of complete defeat. She was too far away from her parents. She wasn't going to make it to them in time. It was almost as if she felt she had no choice but to turn around and finally see whatever it was that was hunting her. So, terrified beyond words, so scared and so tired she could barely breathe, Bella slowly turned around. When she turned, she found herself facing a small clearing she had just run past. Because it was a clearing, a little bit of moonlight was able to filter down through the trees, just enough to illuminate the space, which was about 50 feet across. As she looked across this clearing, at first she saw nothing. And then a tall, dark figure walked into the clearing from the trees on the other side. As soon as it stepped into the faint light, she could see it had a bell tied at its waist. With every single step it took, its leg would strike the bell, causing that violent ringing sound. This thing started moving across the clearing, and as Bella stared at it, it was like time slowed down. She couldn't process what she was seeing. She didn't know what it was. All she knew was that whatever or whoever this was, it was coming straight for her. And then, suddenly, Bella felt an unbelievable rush of adrenaline. It was like her body went into autopilot, a pure survival instinct. She turned around and began sprinting faster than she had ever sprinted in her entire life. And as she ran, all she could hear was the sound of that bell, which she now understood was the sound of its steps. The bell was getting faster and faster, louder and louder. She knew it was gaining on her. She started screaming out loud, lying, "I'm on the phone with the police! They're right up ahead. They're going to be here any second." But whatever was behind her wasn't fazed. It just kept charging forward, closing the distance second by second. Meanwhile, her parents had made it to the meeting spot. But her father couldn't just stand there and wait. He started charging deeper into the woods towards the sounds. He could hear his daughter's screams, he could hear the bell getting louder and louder, and he just ran straight towards it. And sure enough, just seconds later, he saw his daughter compounding out of the dark forest. She saw him and leaped into his arms. He grabbed her, turned around, and ran with her back to the meeting spot. He grabbed his wife, and the three of them just charged out of the forest, back to the parking lot, back into their car. And they sped away. In the car, all of them were crying. They had no idea what to make of what had just happened. Bella was trying to describe what she saw, but she couldn't get the words out. Her parents had been on the phone listening to their daughter's terrified screams, and all they kept saying to each other was, "I heard the bell. I heard the bell. I heard the bell." That sound confirmed their worst nightmares. There really was someone or something out in those woods that was trying to harm their child. They drove straight to the police station, where Bella filed a report about everything she had experienced in the forest. Afterwards, as a precaution, her parents took her to the hospital. She was determined to be physically okay, besides some bumps and bruises from falling. The following morning, the police went out to the forest. They went to the area Bella had described and conducted a thorough search all along the animal trail and the stream. But they never found any sign of this tall, dark figure with the bell. Bella had told the police that she was carrying a handbag and that she had dropped it while she was running. She remembered exactly where along the stream she had dropped it, but when the police searched that area, the bag was gone. Also, the beaver was no longer there. It wasn't tied to the tree, and it wasn't on the ground. It had vanished. The only thing the police found that was out of the ordinary was a t-shirt. A little ways off from the stream, basically along the path Bella would have been running, they found a t-shirt that was neatly folded and placed carefully underneath a rock. But the police, Bella and her family, had no idea what that was supposed to mean. Ultimately, the police told Bella and her family that more than likely what she had run into was some kind of mentally unstable person who was living out in the woods. Perhaps when Bella came into the forest, this person felt like she was trespassing on their property, and so they tried to scare her away. But Bella has a very hard time accepting that explanation. She felt with every fiber of her being that as she was running from whoever was behind her, she was in mortal danger. She believes that if her father hadn't run into the woods and literally grabbed her and carried her the rest of the way, she might not have gotten out of there at all. She might have been attacked and killed by whatever that was. And when she looks back on the experience, she can't help but think about that moment when she turned around and looked across that clearing. When she saw that figure step into the moonlight for the first time, she remembers that the way it was moving, the steps it was taking, they weren't normal. They were abnormal, disjointed. There was something so off about its movement that for a second, it didn't even seem like she was looking at a person, but maybe some kind of large animal. Since her ordeal, there have been no other strange sightings reported in those woods. But then again, almost no one ever goes into that part of the forest except for Bella and her family. And Bella and her family, they don't go in those woods anymore. So whoever or whatever is out there is still just out there. The police never found anyone or anything in that forest. No trace of the shadow. No trace of the beaver. Nothing. It's just an empty forest and the sound of a bell that no one can fully explain. To this day, Bella and her family refuse to ever go near that forest again, because anything out there has never proven that it has left. In October of 2014, a 35-year-old woman, who we will call Olivia, was going about her normal day in Western New York. It was a crisp, cool autumn day, the kind of day where the leaves are turning vibrant shades of orange and red, and there is a slight chill in the air. Olivia had planned a simple, quiet day, but she was looking forward to one specific event. She was going to meet her husband for lunch at a local restaurant. They had not seen much of each other during the busy work week, so they wanted to sit down, catch up, and enjoy a nice meal together. When they arrived at the restaurant, they were greeted by the warm aroma of fresh food, and they were seated at a comfortable table in the corner. Originally, they had not planned to stay at this restaurant for very long. They figured they would grab a quick bite, chat for maybe 45 minutes, and then get back to their respective schedules. But as they started talking, they realized how much they had missed each other's company. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and they found themselves laughing and sharing stories about their week. One thing led to another, and before they knew it, the hours were just flying by. They ordered some appetizers, which included a large basket of warm, freshly baked bread. They ate the bread with butter, enjoying every bite. Then they ordered their main courses, which consisted of large plates of pasta covered in rich, heavy sauces. They talked through the entire meal, and when they finished, they decided they were having such a good time that they did not want it to end just yet. So they ordered some cakes and other desserts, along with some coffee. By the time they finally looked at their watches, they were absolutely shocked to see that it was 6 in the evening. They had been sitting at that restaurant for 6 hours. Over those 6 hours, both Olivia and her husband had consumed a massive amount of food. They had eaten multiple baskets of bread, heavy pasta dishes, and sweet cakes. Along with all of this food, they had also ordered some alcoholic drinks. However, because both of them knew they had to drive home afterward, they were extremely careful about how much they drank. Olivia made sure to pace herself very strictly. Over the entire 6-hour period, she only had 4 alcoholic drinks. Since she had spread those 4 drinks out over such a long time, she knew she would be completely sober and safe to drive. Her husband was equally cautious, limiting his own drinking to make sure he was well under the legal limit. After they got the check and paid for their large meal, they walked out to the parking lot. The sun had already gone down, and it was dark outside. They said their goodbyes, gave each other a hug, and hopped into their respective cars to begin the drive home. As Olivia was driving down the dark roads of Western New York, navigating the familiar turns, she suddenly heard a loud, jarring pop from the front of her car. The steering wheel violently jerked in her hands, and the vehicle began to pull heavily to the right. She immediately realized that she had gotten a flat tire. Olivia kept her cool, slowly steering her car off to the side of the road, and pulled over onto the shoulder. She put the car in park, turned on her hazard lights, and pulled her phone out of her purse. She called roadside assistance to report the flat tire and asked for a tow truck or a mechanic to come out and help her change it. As she was waiting inside her warm car, she decided to step outside for a moment to look at the damage. The air was cold, and she stood near the front passenger side tire, which was completely flat and resting on the rim. At this exact moment, another motorist happened to drive past her on the dark road. This driver saw Olivia standing outside her car with a severely deflated tire. In the darkness, the driver completely misunderstood the situation. They did not see a woman waiting for roadside assistance. They thought she had just been in a major car accident and might be in shock or injured. Concerned for her safety, the passing motorist decided to call the police and report that a woman had been in an accident on the side of the road. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up behind Olivia's vehicle. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dark road. 2 police officers got out of their cruiser and walked up to Olivia. They asked her if she was okay and if she had been involved in an accident. Olivia smiled, trying to reassure them, and said that she was totally fine. She explained that she had simply gotten a flat tire and was just waiting for roadside assistance to arrive. She thanked them for stopping to check on her. But as the officers stood there listening to her speak, they began to notice some classic signs of intoxication. They saw that her eyes looked glassy and glazed over, which is a common indicator of alcohol consumption. Furthermore, as she was speaking to them, they could have sworn she was slurring her words and speaking a bit slower than normal. This made the officers highly suspicious. They looked at her and asked if she had been drinking tonight. Olivia, wanting to be honest, told them that yes, she had had a few drinks, but she quickly explained that she had only consumed 4 drinks over the course of a 6-hour lunch, and she insisted that she did not feel drunk at all. She told them her flat tire had nothing to do with her drinking, and she was completely sober. The police officers, however, were not buying her story. Her physical appearance and the way she was speaking did not match her claim of being sober. They decided to put her through a series of field sobriety tests. They had her step away from her car and perform several physical tasks. They had her walk in a straight line, placing her heel to her toe, turn around, and walk back. They had her stand on one leg while counting out loud. They also did the eye test, where she had to follow a pen with her eyes without moving her head. Olivia managed to complete the tests, but she struggled with them just enough to send up some major red flags for the officers. At this point, they were convinced she was impaired, so they pulled out a breathalyzer device and asked her to blow into it. A breathalyzer is a small handheld tool that measures the amount of alcohol in a person's system by analyzing their breath, giving a reading of their blood alcohol content, or BAC. In the United States, the legal limit for operating a motor vehicle is 0.08%. To give you an idea of what that means, if a typical 160-pound woman were to drink about 3 or 4 alcoholic beverages in a single hour, her BAC would likely rise to right around that 0.08 limit. If that same woman were to consume 8 drinks in an hour, her BAC would spike to 0.20%. At that level, she would be incredibly drunk, unable to function, and would likely be suffering from alcohol poisoning, eventually losing consciousness. And if she were to drink 13 alcoholic drinks in an hour, her BAC would jump all the way up to a lethal 0.40%, which is a level where a person is at risk of dying from alcohol toxicity. Olivia was completely confident when she took the breathalyzer. She knew she had only had 4 drinks over 6 hours, which meant her body should have easily processed the alcohol, leaving her well below the legal limit of 0.08%. She blew into the tube and waited for the device to register her level. When the numbers appeared on the screen, the police officers stared at it in complete shock. They looked at each other, then back at the screen, and then at Olivia. The device read a staggering 0.33%. This was an impossibly high number. At a 0.33% BAC, a normal human being should be slipping into unconsciousness or actively dying. Yet here was Olivia, standing on the side of the road, speaking to them, and appearing only slightly buzzed. The officers immediately assumed that their breathalyzer machine must be broken or malfunctioning. It was the only logical explanation. So they walked back to their patrol car, grabbed a completely different breathalyzer device, and brought it over. They had Olivia blow into the second machine, but when the second reading popped up, the result was exactly the same. She blew a 0.33% BAC once again. The officers were completely mystified by how this woman could have such an extreme, superhuman tolerance to alcohol. But regardless of their confusion, they had to follow the law. They charged her with driving while intoxicated, placed her under arrest, and decided to transport her straight to the local hospital so medical professionals could intervene and monitor her safety, given how dangerously high her alcohol levels were. When she arrived at the hospital, doctors immediately admitted her and began running blood tests. But as the hours rolled by, the mystery only grew deeper. A full 24 hours passed, during which Olivia was kept in a hospital room with absolutely no access to alcohol. Yet, when doctors tested her blood again, her blood alcohol content was still incredibly high. It made absolutely no sense. How could someone who had not consumed a single drop of alcohol in 24 hours still have a massive amount of alcohol in their system? The doctors were completely baffled, and they began running a series of specialized medical tests to figure out what was happening inside her body. It was during this extensive medical investigation that they made a shocking discovery. It turned out that Olivia had an incredibly rare and bizarre medical condition known as autobrewery syndrome. In simple terms, this condition meant that her digestive system had a unique imbalance of yeast and fungi that literally acted like a brewery. When Olivia consumed carbohydrates or glucose, such as the bread, pasta, and cakes she had eaten during her 6-hour lunch, her digestive system would ferment those sugars and turn them directly into pure alcohol inside her body. Olivia had been completely unaware of this condition her entire life. She had developed an incredibly high tolerance to alcohol over the years because her body was essentially brewing its own alcohol all the time, making her constantly drunk without her even realizing it. She was not a heavy drinker, but because she ate normal carbohydrates like bread and pasta, her body was constantly producing its own supply of alcohol. The doctors explained that if this condition is left untreated, it can cause the exact same severe organ damage, liver failure, and cognitive issues as chronic heavy alcoholism. The only way to treat autobrewery syndrome is to make a drastic, permanent change in diet. Once Olivia's medical diagnosis was officially confirmed and made public to the court, the prosecutors realized she had no idea she was impaired and had not willingly consumed that much alcohol, so they dropped all the charges against her. Olivia was incredibly relieved, and she immediately made the decision to completely eliminate carbohydrates from her diet, resolving to never eat bread or pasta again to keep her body from brewing alcohol. Now, let us move on to our second story, which takes us back in time to the year 1887. In Paris, France, there was a 35-year-old man named Robert Ladru. Robert was an exceptionally talented detective working for the Parisian police force. He had a brilliant mind for details, an incredible ability to read people, and a logical approach to solving crimes that made him famous throughout the country. He was so skilled that whenever police departments in other towns and cities across France encountered a case that they simply could not solve, they would write letters to the headquarters in Paris and beg for Robert to be sent to help them. He was essentially the ultimate detective, a man who could see the tiny details that everyone else missed. In the spring of 1887, a peaceful, small coastal town in northern France was facing a terrifying mystery. Over the course of several months, a number of local sailors had suddenly gone missing. They would go out for walks or head down to the docks at night, and they would never return. No bodies were found, no signs of struggles were discovered, and the local police force had absolutely no leads or suspects. The townspeople were growing increasingly panicked, and the local authorities were completely out of their depth. So, they reached out to Paris and requested the assistance of Robert Ladru. Robert accepted the assignment and began the long journey from Paris to the northern coast. Traveling in those days was slow and tiring, and by the time Robert finally arrived in the small coastal town, it was extremely late at night. The streets were pitch black, and the cool ocean breeze was blowing through the empty town. Robert was completely exhausted from his travels, so he decided that he would not begin his investigation that night. Instead, he went straight to a local hotel, checked into his room, and went to bed, falling into a deep and heavy sleep. The next morning, Robert woke up feeling refreshed and ready to work. He got dressed, gathered his notebook, and walked down to the local police station to meet with the chief of police and the other officers he would be working with on the missing sailors case. But when he walked into the station, he noticed that the atmosphere was chaotic and tense. The officers were running around, talking in hushed, panicked voices, and there was a sense of urgency in the air. Robert walked up to the chief of police, who looked incredibly tired and stressed. The chief apologized to Robert and delivered some shocking news. He explained that the case of the missing sailors had suddenly been lowered in priority. The reason was that during the night, a brutal murder had been committed right on the town's local beach. This was the first murder the quiet town had seen in years, and the entire police force had to be mobilized to investigate it immediately. The chief told Robert that he was deeply sorry for bringing him all the way from Paris for the missing sailors case, only to change plans, but then he asked Robert if he would be willing to help them investigate this fresh beach murder instead. Robert, being a dedicated lawman, did not hesitate. He told the chief that he would be honored to assist them in any way he could. The chief began to share the details of the crime. The victim was a middle-aged man named André Monet. André was a well-respected man who owned a successful and popular dress shop in Paris. He had recently decided to retire or take a break from the busy city life, so he had bought a home in this quiet coastal town to relax and enjoy the beautiful ocean views. But early that morning, a local resident walking along the beach had spotted a body lying in the sand. It was André. The police had rushed to the scene and conducted an initial examination of the body. They determined that André had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest. The bullet had traveled with intense force, passing clean through his body and exiting out his back. But the problem was, the police had not been able to find the bullet anywhere in the surrounding sand. They had no suspects, no leads, and no obvious motive. The officers were able to rule out robbery almost immediately because when they searched Andre's clothing, they found that his wallet, his money, and all of his expensive jewelry were still completely intact on his person. Whoever had killed Andre had not done it for money. Robert, the chief of police, and several local officers left the station and walked down to the beach to examine the crime scene. The beach was a wide stretch of soft sand, bordered by a steep stone wall and a set of wooden stairs that led up to the main coastal road. The local officers immediately went to work near the spot where Andre's body had been found, dropping to their knees to sift through the sand, desperately searching for the missing bullet that had passed through the victim. Robert, however, decided to take a different path. He knew that the immediate area around a body is often contaminated by first responders, so he walked a short distance down the beach, keeping his eyes glued to the ground, looking for any subtle clues that others might have overlooked. After walking just a little ways away from the main scene, Robert stopped in his tracks. In the soft, damp sand, he noticed a set of footprints. They were barely visible, but they were definitely there. As Robert followed the footprints with his eyes, he saw that they came from the direction of the town, passed directly by the spot where Andre's body had been found, and then continued past the crime scene toward the wooden stairs. The prints went up the stairs and then disappeared completely once they hit the hard pavement of the road. Robert called the other officers over and showed them the footprints. He instructed them to immediately make plaster casts of the prints so they could preserve the evidence and analyze them. Making a plaster cast is a standard forensic technique. The officers would mix liquid plaster in a bucket, carefully pour it into the impressions in the sand, and then wait for it to dry and harden. Once dry, they would pull the hardened plaster out, and it would give them a perfect three-dimensional replica of the exact shape and size of the shoe or foot that had made the print. While the officers were busy preparing the plaster, Robert stood over the prints, staring at them with a look of deep concentration. One of the officers noticed his expression and asked him what he was thinking. Robert replied that the footprints looked incredibly odd to him. He said they felt strangely familiar, as if he had seen them somewhere before, but he simply could not place where or when he had seen them. Less than an hour later, the plaster had dried completely. The officers carefully pried the casts out of the sand, brushed away the loose dirt, and handed them to Robert. The moment Robert's hands touched the plaster casts and he looked down at the shapes, his body physically reacted. He gasped, his face was completely pale, and a look of absolute horror and disappointment washed over him. He did not say a single word to the officers standing around him. He simply turned around, holding the plaster casts tightly against his chest, and walked away. He walked down the beach to a highly secluded, rocky area where no one could see him. He sat down on a cold rock and placed the plaster casts in front of him. And then he just sat there. He sat there for hours and hours, completely motionless, staring intently at the white plaster shapes. The hours ticked by, and the hot afternoon sun blazed down on him, but he did not seem to feel the heat. The tide began to turn, and the ocean water started to rapidly creep up the beach, splashing against the rocks near his feet, but he did not move a muscle. He was completely lost in his own mind, staring at the plaster. The local officers watched him from a distance, utterly mystified by his behavior. They did not know what to make of this legendary Parisian detective sitting alone on the rocks for hours. But because of his massive reputation as a genius, they did not dare to interrupt him or ask him what he was doing. They simply assumed he was engaging in some highly advanced detective method that was far beyond their understanding. Finally, as the afternoon was beginning to fade, Robert stood up. He picked up the plaster casts, walked back over to the waiting officers, and looked them in the eyes. He told them that there was no reason to stay at the beach any longer, and there was no need to interview any more witnesses because he believed he had solved the case. But once again, instead of elaborating or explaining his theory, he simply turned around, walked up the wooden stairs, and headed back to his hotel. The local officers looked at each other, completely baffled, and shrugged their shoulders. Having nothing left to do, they packed up their equipment and returned to the station. Early the next morning, one of the officers searching the beach finally found the bullet that had killed Andre Monet. It was buried deep in the sand near the crime scene. When Robert arrived at the beach later that morning to meet with the police, the chief of police walked up to him with a look of excitement and handed him the bullet, believing this would be the final piece of evidence Robert needed to arrest the killer. Robert took the small metal bullet, looked at it closely, and let out a deep, heavy sigh. He looked at the chief of police with tears in his eyes and said that now he knew for sure what had happened. He then proceeded to describe the murder in vivid, precise detail. Robert told the officers that on the night of the crime, the killer had woken up in the middle of the night in his hotel room. The killer had gotten out of bed, put on his clothes, and walked out into the dark night, heading straight down to the beach. While walking along the shore, the killer encountered Andre Monet, who was also out for a late-night walk. The two men had a friendly conversation at first, but at some point, a sudden and intense argument broke out between them. In a moment of anger, the killer pulled out his revolver, shot Andre directly in the chest, and then quickly fled the scene, walking back up the stairs to his room. The chief of police was amazed by this detailed reconstruction and asked Robert how he could possibly know all of this. Robert looked at him and said that he knew because he was the killer. He had killed Andre Monet. But he explained that he did not do it on purpose, and he had absolutely no memory of doing it because he had been sleepwalking. Robert explained that when he looked at the plaster casts of the footprints on the beach, he realized why they looked so familiar. The cast showed that whoever had made those prints was missing a toe. And, as it happened, Robert himself was missing a toe. The footprints in the sand matched his own feet perfectly. Furthermore, when he had woken up in his hotel room that morning, before he even knew a murder had occurred, he had noticed that his shoes and socks next to his bed were damp and covered in wet sand. He had thought it was strange at the time, but he was in a hurry to get to the police station, so he had ignored it. After spending hours staring at the casts on the beach, he had gone back to his hotel room and checked his personal revolver, which he kept hidden under his pillow. He always kept the gun fully loaded, but when he checked it, he was horrified to find that one bullet was missing. He spent the entire night trying to convince himself that it was all just a terrible coincidence, but when the chief of police handed him the bullet found on the beach, all doubt was erased. The bullet was the exact rare type of ammunition that Robert used in his personal gun. He had caught himself. The police were absolutely stunned. They could not believe that their star detective, a man of such high standing, was responsible for this terrible crime. They wondered if Robert was having a mental breakdown or if this was some incredibly elaborate cover-up. To test whether he was actually telling the truth about his sleepwalking, they decided to conduct a scientific experiment. Robert agreed to cooperate fully. The police placed him inside a secure jail cell where he would be monitored 24 hours a day by armed guards. They placed his personal revolver under his pillow, but they loaded it with blank rounds instead of live ammunition. They told him to go to sleep as he normally would. For the first few nights, nothing happened. Robert slept peacefully, and he never reached for the gun. But about a week into the experiment, in the dead of night, the guards watching the cell saw Robert suddenly sit up. He was in a deep trance-like state, his eyes wide open but completely vacant, staring into nothingness. He slowly reached his hand under his pillow, pulled out the revolver, aimed it directly at the guards standing outside his cell, and began firing the blank rounds. This terrifying demonstration completely convinced the police and the medical experts that Robert was telling the absolute truth. he had indeed killed Andre Monet while completely unconscious in a state of sleepwalking. Because he lacked any criminal intent or conscious awareness of his actions, the authorities decided that it would not be right to prosecute him for murder. However, they also recognized that he was incredibly dangerous to the public when he fell asleep. To protect everyone, they made the difficult decision to exile Robert. For the rest of his life, until he passed away in 1937, Robert Ladru was forced to live in complete isolation on a secluded farm far outside of Paris. The only people he ever saw were medical doctors who would visit him to study his condition. But even then, the doctors would only visit during the bright daylight hours, and they always made sure to bring armed bodyguards with them, just in case Robert were to fall asleep. Now, let us move on to our third and final story, which begins on the 18th of December, 1956, with the premiere of a brand new television game show called To Tell the Truth. This show was broadcast on a major American television network and quickly became a massive sensation across the country. The premise of the game show was incredibly simple yet highly entertaining. In each episode, a panel of 4 celebrity judges would be introduced to 3 different contestants. All 3 of these contestants would claim to be the exact same person. This person was always someone remarkable, someone who had achieved something extraordinary, possessed an incredible talent, or lived a highly unusual and fascinating life. While all 3 contestants claimed to be this remarkable person, only one of them was telling the truth. The other 2 contestants were imposters who had been thoroughly briefed on the real person's life, and their job was to lie as convincingly as possible to trick the celebrity judges. During the show, the host would read a brief biography of the real, remarkable person. After the biography was read, the celebrity judges would have a set amount of time to ask all 3 contestants various questions about their background, their career, their achievements, and their personal lives. The judges would listen closely to their answers, trying to spot any lies, hesitation, or inconsistencies. Once the questioning period was over, each of the 4 celebrity judges would cast a vote for the contestant they believed was telling the truth. After the votes were tallied, the host of the show would look at the contestants and say the famous line, "Will the real person please stand up?" The true individual would then stand up, the audience would erupt in thunderous applause, and the imposters would smile and congratulate them. The show was incredibly popular, and it ran for decades, producing thousands of episodes that were watched by millions of Americans. For the most part, the episodes were very lighthearted, fun, and predictable. But there was one specific episode that would go down in television history as the absolute most unique, bizarre, and chilling episode ever recorded. Fast forward to October of 1972. On this particular evening, 3 clean-cut, polite men walked out onto the stage and took their places in front of the 4 celebrity judges. All 3 of them wore nice suits, smiled warmly at the audience, and introduced themselves as Ed Edwards. The host of the show then stepped up to his podium and began reading the biography of the real Ed Edwards. The biography was fascinating. The host explained that at one point in his life, Ed Edwards had been a highly dangerous criminal. In fact, he had been so prolific and dangerous that he had earned a spot on the FBI's list of the top 10 most wanted fugitives in America. He had committed multiple armed robberies, impersonated federal officers, and broken out of jail. But then, while serving a long prison sentence, a compassionate prison guard had taken an interest in him and helped him turn his life around. Upon his release from prison 14 years later, Ed had supposedly become a completely reformed man. He had written a successful autobiography, and he had become a popular motivational speaker. He traveled around the country talking to youth groups, civic organizations, and business leaders, teaching people how to identify con men, how to spot criminals, and how to protect themselves from being victims of crime. After this impressive biography was read, the 3 contestants sat down, and the celebrity judges began asking them questions. The judges asked about his time on the run, his experiences in prison, the process of writing his book, and how he had managed to change his life. All three men answered the questions with confidence, charm, and poise. When the time was up, the celebrity judges cast their votes. Two of the four judges correctly guessed which man was the real Ed Edwards. When the host finally asked the real Ed Edwards to stand up, a man in a neat suit and glasses stood up, smiling warmly. The audience clapped loudly, completely charmed by him. He did not look like an ex-convict or a dangerous fugitive. He looked like an ordinary, friendly, all-American father who lived next door, someone who loved his family and wouldn't hurt a fly. He seemed completely harmless, and the episode ended on a highly positive, inspiring note. After the episode aired, the public eventually forgot about Ed Edwards, and he faded back into ordinary life. But decades later, in 2009, a dark and terrifying truth would finally begin to emerge. Ed Edwards had a daughter named April Blasio. In 2009, April was a 40-year-old woman, but she had spent her entire childhood and adult life plagued by deep suspicion and fear regarding her father. Despite her father's public claims that he was a completely reformed man, a loving father, and a law-abiding citizen, April never believed it. Behind the closed doors of their family home, Ed Edwards was not a warm, charming, motivational speaker. He was an incredibly violent, abusive man with a terrifying temper. He was also a compulsive liar who manipulated everyone around him. During the 1970s and 1980s, when April was just a young girl, her father would suddenly force the entire family to pack up all of their belongings and move to a new town. These moves did not happen with planning or preparation. Often, in the middle of the night, Ed would wake the children up, tell them to grab what they could, throw everything into the car, and drive away to a completely different state. April was always deeply unsettled by this. She assumed that her dad was constantly running from the law or involved in some sort of serious criminal activity. Whenever she or her mother would ask Ed why they had to keep moving so suddenly, Ed always had a quick, convincing explanation. He would tell them that when he was in prison, he had acted as an informant and had snitched on some highly dangerous people. He claimed that those dangerous criminals had finally tracked down where they were living, and so the family had to flee immediately to protect their lives. April knew deep down that her father was lying to her, but as a child, there was nothing she could do. They kept moving from town to town, state to state, never staying in one place for very long. But she could never shake the feeling that her father was hiding a much darker, more sinister secret. Fast forward to 2009. April was now 40 years old, and she was laying in her bed late one night, unable to sleep. Her mind began to wander back to her childhood and the strange, chaotic life her father had forced them to live. She decided that she was finally going to do some investigating of her own. She got out of bed, opened her laptop, and opened a search engine. She decided to start typing in the names of the various small towns where her family had briefly lived during her childhood. She decided she would type the name of a town, followed by phrases like unsolved murder or unsolved mystery, to see if anything had happened in those towns during the exact brief windows of time that her family had lived there. As she began her search, she went through several towns with no results. But then she typed in the name of a town called Watertown, Wisconsin. Her family had lived there for a very brief period in 1980. When she pressed search, an article popped up that made her stomach drop. The article described an unsolved double homicide that had occurred in Watertown in August of 1980. A young teenage couple had been attending a wedding reception. At some point during the evening, they decided to leave the reception and drive down a quiet, dead-end road to spend some time alone together in their car. While they were sitting in the car, an unknown man had suddenly walked out of the darkness, approached the vehicle, broke inside, and shot both teenagers to death before disappearing into the night. The police had a vague description of the suspect, but they had never been able to solve the case. As April read the details of the crime, she realized that the murder had occurred during the exact small window of time that her family had been living in Watertown. Furthermore, the physical description of the suspect matched her father, Ed Edwards, perfectly. Acting on a strong gut instinct, April called the Watertown Police Department the very next day. She spoke to a detective and explained that she believed her father might be responsible for the 1,980 double murder. She explained that they had lived in the area at the time and that her father fit the physical description of the killer perfectly. She also shared her father's criminal history and his violent nature. The detectives were intrigued by her call. They decided to look into Ed Edwards, who was currently living in Kentucky as an elderly man. They tracked him down and managed to obtain a sample of his DNA. They sent the sample to a laboratory to be compared with the DNA evidence that had been recovered from the crime scene back in 1980. A short time later, the results came back. The DNA was a perfect match. Ed Edwards was indeed the killer. In 2009, police officers arrested Ed Edwards at his home in Kentucky and extradited him to Wisconsin to face charges for the double murder. As soon as Ed was placed in custody and realized that the police had his DNA, his entire demeanor changed. He did not deny the crimes. Instead, he immediately confessed to the murders of the young couple. But then, Ed did something very strange. He asked the prosecutors if he could receive the death penalty for his crimes. He was an elderly, sick man, and he seemed to want the state to execute him. However, the prosecutors explained to him that under Wisconsin law, the maximum punishment for his crimes was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Wisconsin did not have the death penalty. Ed was incredibly frustrated by this news. He did not want to spend the rest of his life rotting in a prison cell. So he decided to use his knowledge of other crimes as a bargaining chip. He reached out to detectives and confessed to another double homicide that he had committed back in 1,977 Inches, Ohio. In that case, he had targeted and murdered another young teenage couple. Ed believed that by confessing to these murders in Ohio, he would be eligible for the death penalty. But through a legal loophole and the specific laws of that state at the time, the prosecutors told him that he was still only facing life in prison. Even more frustrated, Ed decided to play his final card. He revealed a third, highly chilling murder that he had committed in 1996. He confessed that he had murdered his own foster son, a young man named Danny Boy Edwards. Ed had taken the young man in, raised him, and then killed him in cold blood in order to collect a massive double indemnity life insurance policy. Because this murder was committed for financial gain and involved a vulnerable victim, it met the legal criteria for capital punishment. Ed was finally convicted and sentenced to death, just as he had wanted. However, before the state could carry out the execution, Ed Edwards died of natural causes in a prison hospital in 2011 at the age of 77. But the story of Ed Edelum does not end with his death. Since his passing, cold case investigators, journalists, and even members of his own family, including April, have spent years looking into his life. They have realized that Ed Edwards is almost certainly responsible for many more killings beyond the 5 that he officially confessed to. In fact, some investigators have put forward a highly compelling and terrifying theory. They believe that Ed Edwards may actually be the infamous Zodiac Killer, one of the most notorious and elusive serial killers in American history, who terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s, claiming to have killed 37 people. While this theory has never been officially proven, the timelines, geographical locations, and psychological profiles of Ed Edwards and the Zodiac Killer match up in ways that are deeply unsettling. If this theory is indeed true, it means that when Ed Edwards walked out onto the stage of To Tell the Truth in October of 1972, stood in front of the flashing television lights, smiled warmly at the celebrity judges, and answered their questions with charm and confidence, he was not a reformed man at all. He was actively a highly prolific, active serial killer who had already taken the lives of dozens of innocent people. He was hiding his true, monstrous nature in plain sight, using a national television broadcast to show off his ability to lie and manipulate. Ed Edwards stopped confessing to murders after his third confession because he had gotten exactly what he wanted, which was the death penalty. Once he secured that sentence, he went completely silent, refusing to cooperate or share any more details about his past. And now that he is dead, the secrets of his true crimes have been buried with him. Without his cooperation, and with so many decades having passed, it is highly unlikely that investigators will ever be able to connect him to other unsolved cold cases. The families of his potential victims are left with unanswered questions, and we will likely never know the true, horrifying extent of Ed Edwards' reign of terror. These three stories show us that the world is full of strange, dark, and mysterious events that we can barely begin to comprehend. From a woman whose own body brewed alcohol, to a brilliant detective who hunted himself down, to a serial killer who stood smiling on a national television stage, the truth is often far more unbelievable than any fiction we could ever write. We must always remember to look closely at the details of our lives, because sometimes the most shocking revelations are hiding in the things we take for granted. Olivia had no idea that her simple love for bread and pasta was triggering a chemical factory in her stomach. Detective Robert Ladrew spent a lifetime solving the secrets of other people, only to realize his own sleeping body was carrying out a quiet tragedy on a lonely beach. And April Blasio had to grow up in the shadow of a father whose public life was an inspiring story of redemption, while his private life was a trail of blood and deception. These stories leave us with a lingering sense of mystery and a reminder that human behavior is complex, unpredictable, and sometimes deeply haunting. We are left to wonder about the secrets that still remain buried, the mysteries that have never been solved, and the quiet truths that are still waiting in the dark to be discovered. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. They thought they were just being adventurous, a group of 7 friends taking a harmless detour to a secret swimming spot deep in the New Zealand forest. They heard the warning siren not once, but 3 times. But they didn't understand it. And that one mistake, mistaking danger for something harmless, would turn a perfect day into a fight for survival against a wall of water they never saw coming. But to understand how 7 smart, careful young people ended up in that situation, we need to go back just a few hours earlier. On the morning of Monday, the 6th of February 2017, the air in New Zealand was thick with the lazy, happy feeling of a national holiday. For a tight-knit group of 7 college friends, it was the perfect end to a perfect weekend. They were just starting to stir, packing up their cars to make the 3-hour drive from the scenic area around Lake Tekapo back to the bustling city of Auckland, where their regular lives were waiting for them. The night before had been a blast. They'd been to a huge concert on the lake called Flocella. The whole concept was pretty cool. Everyone was out on the water on these big inflatable rafts and floats, listening to music under the open sky. It was one of those memorable nights that define your youth. After the concert wrapped up, they didn't go wild. They headed to a nearby relative's house, had a quiet little after party with a couple of drinks, and everyone was in bed a little after midnight. They were responsible, just a group of good friends enjoying their time together. This particular morning, the plan was to get up early and hit the road. February 6th is Waitangi Day in New Zealand, a major public holiday, and they knew the roads back to Auckland would be jammed with traffic if they didn't get a head start. So they were up, packing their bags, cleaning up, the familiar routine of ending a trip. They had 3 cars between the 7 of them, and just as they finished loading the last of their things, right when they were about to get in and start the engines, one of the friends piped up with an idea. Her name was Rachel DeYoung. She was 21 years old, full of life, and the kind of person who was always looking for a little bit of adventure. Rachel suggested they take a quick detour before heading straight home. She told the group that she and another friend in the group, a girl named Maddie, had found out about this incredible secret swimming spot. It was only about 15 minutes away from where they were, and better yet, it was basically right on their way back to Auckland. She described it as this beautiful, secluded pool of green-blue water tucked away in the middle of a forest. The pool was technically part of the Waikato River, but in that specific area, the river was mostly very shallow or completely dry most of the time. This made the pool look like its own isolated, pristine little oasis. It sounded magical. She explained that there wasn't an official marked trail to get to it, which only added to the appeal. Instead, there was a kind of unofficial dirt path that had been worn into the forest floor over the years by locals who knew about the spot. It was their own little secret. The idea was immediately popular. Who wouldn't want to cap off a great weekend with a swim in a secret, beautiful spot? It was spontaneous and adventurous. The decision was unanimous. Everyone piled into the 3 cars, a small convoy of friends, ready for one last bit of fun before returning to reality. By around 11:40 inches the morning, with Rachel and Maddie giving directions, they found the spot. It was just like Rachel had described. A winding main road, and right off the side of it, the subtle beginning of a dirt trail leading into the woods. They carefully pulled their cars over, making sure they were safely off the road, and the 7 of them got out. The air was fresh and clean. Rachel and Maddie led the way, and the group disappeared into the trees, following the narrow path. The walk was easy, and they were all chatting and laughing, excited about the swim. About 15 minutes into their hike, at exactly 11:55 a.m., they could tell they were getting close. Up ahead, the dense canopy of trees was starting to thin out, a sure sign that they were approaching a clearing or a body of water. But then, something strange happened. The group suddenly stopped in their tracks. From somewhere out in the forest, way off in front of them, a loud, shrill siren sound cut through the peace and quiet. It was high-pitched and piercing. It blared on for what felt like a long time, maybe 20 or 30 seconds, and then it just stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy. The 7 friends just stood there on the trail, looking around and then at each other with confused expressions. No one had any idea what it could be. An ambulance? A fire truck? It didn't make any sense. They were deep in a forest, far from any town. There were no houses or buildings nearby. After a moment of collective uncertainty, they just kind of shrugged. It was weird, for sure, but there was no obvious sign of danger. So, they chalked it up to a mystery and kept walking, their excitement for the swimming hole quickly pushing the strange noise out of their minds. Within another minute, they had reached the end of the trail. And the view was worth it. They were standing at the edge of a beautiful overlook, looking down at the pool they had come for. It was just as stunning as Rachel had promised. To get down to the water, they had to climb down some rocks, but someone had installed some ropes to make it easier and safer. One by one, they made their way down to the edge of the pool. Once they were all down, they stripped off their outer layers, revealing their bathing suits underneath, and wasted no time jumping into the cool, refreshing water. It felt amazing. Out in the middle of the pool, 2 large rocks jutted up out of the water like a pair of miniature islands. That became their goal. Rachel and the other 4 women in the group swam out and climbed onto one of the rocks. The 2 men in the group climbed onto the other. They sat there, basking in the sun, taking in the incredible scenery. It was a perfect, peaceful moment. They felt like they had the whole world to themselves. Then, at 11:58 a.m., it happened again. The same loud, piercing siren blasted across the forest. It was the exact same sound they had heard just 3 minutes earlier while they were on the trail. Once again, all 7 of them looked around, and at each other, a bit puzzled. What was this siren all about? But just like before, after the siren went on for about 30 seconds and then stopped, they looked around and saw nothing. There was no smoke, no sign of any emergency, no one else around. The place still looked like a peaceful oasis. So, before long, they forgot about it again. The moment was too perfect to let a weird noise ruin it. Rachel got out her camera and started taking pictures, and others were doing the same, capturing the memory. 2 minutes later, at exactly 12 p.m., the siren sounded for a third time. By this point, the novelty and mystery had worn off. They had heard it twice already, and absolutely nothing had happened. The sound was still jarring. That high-pitched wail really cut through the air, but this time they barely paid it any attention. It was just a strange, recurring noise. They were laughing and talking, and the siren was just background noise. But when that third siren finally came to a stop, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't quiet. A new sound began to emerge, and this one the group immediately noticed. The sound was coming from the same direction the siren had come from, which was effectively upstream. Even though this part of the river was mostly dry, they could easily see the path the riverbed carved through the landscape, heading uphill and around a bend. So all 7 friends turned their heads and looked upstream, listening. The sound was loud, a sort of rumbling, smashing noise. It was getting closer. They exchanged curious and slightly concerned looks with each other, trying to figure out what it could possibly be. And then, all of a sudden, they saw it. A solid white wall of churning water came crashing around the corner of the riverbed up ahead. It was moving incredibly fast, a roaring torrent barreling straight down the dry channel towards them. By the time their brains had even fully processed the impossible sight, the water had reached them. It slammed into their peaceful pool, and the water level began to rise at a terrifying speed. They could literally watch the pool flooding, the water climbing up the rocks they were standing on, higher and higher with each passing second. As the rocks beneath their feet began to submerge, the group had a collective thought. This has to be temporary. Whatever this is, it's going to stop soon. So the initial decision was to just stay put. Hold on, stay on the rocks, and wait it out. They thought they would be okay, but they were wrong. Within seconds, the rocks they were standing on were completely underwater. The torrent was still thundering down the riverbed, filling their pool and then spilling out over the other side, creating a violent, raging rapid where just moments before there had been calm water. They realized with a jolt of panic that if they didn't get off these submerged rocks immediately, they were going to be swept downstream. The 2 men who were on their own rock acted fast. They saw a rocky outcropping a short distance away that was slightly higher up and, most importantly, was connected to the forest on the bank. That outcropping represented safety. They leaped from their disappearing rock over to it. Once they were securely on it, they turned back and started yelling to the 5 women who were still stranded. They shouted for them to try to swim over, that they would grab them and pull them to safety. But it was an impossible request. By now, the water was rushing past the women's knees with incredible force. They could barely keep their balance just standing still. They knew with absolute certainty that if they tried to swim in that current, they would be gone in an instant, swept away by the raging water. The group quickly realized there was only one option. The women would have to literally jump across the churning water and hope the men could catch them. Rachel DeYoung, the one who had suggested this adventure, was the first to try. She took a breath, gathered herself, and leaped off the rock. She reached out, the guys grabbed her arms, and they hauled her onto the rocky ledge to safety. She was safe. She immediately turned around to help. She and the other 2 men now formed a small human chain, their arms outstretched, ready for the next person. At first, the plan seemed to be working. They were managing to get the women across. But then they got down to the second to last woman. She made the jump, and she managed to grab one of the guy's arms, but the force of the water and the pull of her weight caused both of them to lose their footing. In a horrifying instant, the man and the woman were both swept off the rocks and into the rapids, disappearing downstream. Panic set in, but Rachel stayed remarkably calm. She moved into the position where the guy had just been, taking his place. She had her GoPro camera on a selfie stick. She quickly extended it all the way out towards the last woman left on the rock, her friend Alice. She yelled for Alice to jump and grab the selfie stick. Alice, who was now almost completely submerged in the raging water, made a frantic, desperate jump. For one heart-stopping second, she managed to grab onto the end of the selfie stick, but her grip slipped. The current was too strong. She was pulled away, and she too began to be swept downstream. And what happened next was a testament to Rachel's character. Rachel, who was completely safe on that rocky ledge, didn't hesitate for a second. She immediately jumped back into the violent rapids after her friend. She managed to grab hold of Alice and tried to turn back, tried to grab onto a rock to stop them both, but she couldn't get a grip. The current was overwhelming. And so, Rachel and Alice were also swept downstream, out of sight. 2 weeks before Rachel and her friends had ever set foot on that dirt trail, a critical warning sign had been stolen. It was a physical sign, and its purpose was to warn people not to go near the river, not to go near that pool. That sign was normally placed right at the very beginning of the unofficial trail, the exact spot where the 7 friends had parked their cars and started their hike. This meant that when they got out of their cars that day, filled with excitement, there was absolutely nothing to tell them about the incredible danger that lay just a 15-minute walk away. Now, it's true that Rachel and Maddie had known about the swimming spot for several months, but it seems they had only heard about it or seen pictures of it. It doesn't appear that they had ever actually walked the trail and been to the pool themselves. If they had, they would have seen the sign. They simply didn't know the terrible secret the place was hiding. The pool itself wasn't the danger. The danger was where the pool was located. It was right in the middle of a dam spillway. About 650 feet upstream from where they were swimming, there is a large hydroelectric dam. And 3 to 4 times every single day, the dam operators open the floodgates. When they do, they release a staggering 20,000 gallons of water per second down the mostly dry riverbed. That water comes careening down the channel, slams into that pool, and continues on its path. The gates stay open for about 15 minutes at a time, and the only reason this is done is for tourism. It's a spectacle designed to show tourists what the riverbed used to look like before the dam was built, back when it was a set of raging natural rapids. On the 6th of February 2017, the dam was scheduled for a spill at exactly 12 p.m. Those sirens the friends heard at 11:55, 11:58, and again at noon were the dam's warning system. They were meant to alert anyone in the area that a spill was imminent. But, of course, the 7 friends had no way of knowing what the sirens meant. To them, it was just a strange, unexplained noise. After the 12 p.m. spill had finally subsided and the water levels returned to normal, the 3 friends who had made it to the safety of the rocky outcropping began a desperate search. 4 of their friends had been swept away by the current. They scrambled down the riverbank, calling out their names. Miraculously, they found them. 3 of the 4 who had been swept away had somehow survived the violent ride downstream. They were battered and bruised, but they were alive. But 1 had not survived. The sole fatality was 2. 1 year old Rachel DeYoung, the young woman whose idea it was to visit the secret swimming spot in the first place. Rachel, the friend who had already reached safety, but who sacrificed her own life in a heroic attempt to save her friend Alice. Today, if you go to that area of the Waikato River, things look different. There are many more warning signs. There are fences. The warnings are explicit and clear, trying to prevent anyone from making the same mistake. But the dam still operates as it always has. It still spills several times a day for tourists. And despite all the new precautions, despite the widespread media coverage of Rachel's tragic death, people still sneak past the barriers. They still go swimming in that secret pool, drawn by the same beauty that lured Rachel and her friends, either ignorant or uncaring, of the danger that cost a brave young woman her life. Here's the thing about that day in New Zealand. It didn't look dangerous. It didn't feel dangerous. And it definitely didn't sound dangerous, just a strange siren in the distance that no one understood. But that's exactly what made it so deadly. A warning only works if you recognize it for what it is. And for this group of friends, that moment of misunderstanding turned a simple detour into a fight against a force of nature they never even knew was coming. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous situations don't look dangerous at all until it's too late. Until next time. One day in January of 2018, a police officer was making his way through a quiet patch of woods near the small town of Gray in France. And as he walked, his eyes were fixed on the ground because he was following a literal trail of blood. This trail eventually led the officer to the body of a person who had very clearly been shot in the head. Now, at first glance, this had all the markings of a suicide, but the officer had some serious questions. This was not the first body that had been found in these same woods. Another one had been discovered just a couple of months earlier, and it was starting to feel like there was a very disturbing pattern forming here. At around 5 in the evening on the 27th of October 2017, a 29-year-old woman named Alexia Duval was driving her car down a cul-de-sac in that same small, quiet town of Gray. She was on her way to her parents' house to celebrate her nephew's second birthday. It was supposed to be a big family get-together. Her sister, her brother-in-law, and her little nephew had all driven in from Paris, which was about a 4-hour drive away, just for this celebration. But as Alexia drove, she had to admit to herself that she had very mixed feelings about seeing everyone tonight. You see, Alexia had been going through a really difficult time recently. She and her husband of 13 years, Jonathan, had been trying to get pregnant for a while. She had gone through several rounds of fertility treatments, and the process had thrown her hormones completely out of whack. It seemed to affect her a lot more intensely than it did for most women who went through it. And then, after all of that struggle, she had finally gotten pregnant. But just a couple of months ago, she had tragically suffered a miscarriage. So, even though Alexia absolutely adored her sister's family and got along with them wonderfully, the pain of her miscarriage was still very raw. She just knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for her to be around her young nephew. He was a constant, innocent reminder of the baby she had lost. Alexia's car came to a stop outside a gated driveway at the end of the cul-de-sac. She pushed the button on the intercom, and a moment later, the gate swung open. She drove up the long driveway toward a beautiful house with a perfectly kept garden out front. She parked her car in the driveway, right behind her father's white van, and then she got out. She reached into the back seat and grabbed a wrapped present along with a couple of desserts she baked herself. She carried them up to the front door of the house and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened, and her mother, Isabelle Fouillot, stood there with a huge smile on her face. She welcomed Alexia inside and led her into the dining room. Alexia's father, Jean-Pierre, was sitting at the table, deep in conversation with Alexia's brother-in-law, Gregory, and her sister, Stephanie. They all stood up and greeted her with warm hugs. As Alexia started to explain that her husband, Jonathan, was running late and would be there later in a separate car because a job he was on as an electrician had run long, she heard the sound of little feet pattering towards her. A moment later, her 2-year-old nephew, James, ran around the corner and threw his little arms around Alexia's legs. To her own surprise and immense relief, Alexia didn't feel that familiar pang of sadness. All she felt was a wave of pure happiness. She bent down and scooped the little boy up into her arms, giving him a big, warm hug. Then she handed him his birthday present. Eventually, the whole family settled in for dinner. And for a while, all of Alexia's worries and sadness just seemed to melt away. She was incredibly close with everyone at that table, especially her mother and her sister, Stephanie. Just being around them always had a way of lifting her spirits. Alexia's husband, Jonathan, finally arrived sometime around 8:30 that evening. He joined the family, and along with everyone else, he had a wonderful night. They ate, they drank, and they just chatted and laughed together. After dinner was all cleaned up, Alexia's father decided to head to bed, but everyone else stayed up. They all just continued to have this really nice, comfortable time together until around 11 o'clock when Alexia announced that it was probably time for her and Jonathan to head home. They both had early mornings ahead of them. Jonathan had some errands to run, and Alexia was hoping to get a workout in before starting her day. A few minutes later, on the drive home, Alexia sat in the passenger seat of Jonathan's car. She had left her own car back at her parents' house because she had been drinking wine with dinner, and she was planning to just pick it up when they came back the next day. Alexia and Jonathan's house was located on a quiet residential street only about a mile away from her parents' place. And as they drove down their road, Alexia glanced out the window at a particular house just up the street from where they lived. And as she looked at it, her expression soured. The neighbor who lived in that house had an adult grandson who had been harassing Alexia all summer long. He had become obsessed with her and would call and text her constantly, to the point where Alexia didn't even feel safe going out for a jog by herself around their own neighborhood. Fortunately, the harassment had stopped a couple of months ago, but only because the man had been committed to a mental hospital. But Alexia didn't know how long he would be there. She didn't know if he had already been released. So it felt more like a temporary pause than a real, long-term solution. But on this night at least, there was nobody peering out at her from the neighbor's window. A minute later, their car pulled into their garage, and Alexia and Jonathan got out. As Alexia walked from the garage into the main house, she passed by a treadmill that sat in the corner of the garage. It had broken down a few weeks ago. She asked Jonathan if he'd gotten around to fixing it yet, and he told her no, he hadn't. Alexia just sighed. The weather forecast for the next day was supposed to be very cold and gloomy. It looked like she was going to have to go for her run outside after all. The following morning, around 11 o'clock, Jonathan walked up to the front door of Alexia's parents' house and rang the doorbell. As he waited, he cast a worried look over his shoulder at Alexia's car, which was still parked right where they had left it the night before. Jonathan took a deep breath and tried to hide how anxious he was feeling as Alexia's mother, Isabel, answered the door. Then, in a very shaky voice, Jonathan said hello and asked her if she had seen or heard from her daughter recently. When Isabel said she hadn't, Jonathan completely lost his composure. He told her that Alexia had gone out for a jog that morning, but she hadn't come back, and now he was starting to get really worried. He explained that he had tried texting Alexia, but she still hadn't answered. By this point, she should have been home a long, long time ago. Something was wrong. A moment later, Jonathan saw Stephanie and Gregory coming out of the guest room. They had very concerned looks on their faces. They joined Jonathan and Isabel at the front door and asked what all the commotion was about. So, Jonathan frantically re-explained the situation. He asked if either of them had heard from Alexia in the last hour or so, but they both shook their heads and said they hadn't. Stephanie did show Jonathan that she had received a text from Alexia at 9:30 that morning just saying that she was going out for this jog. But after that, none of them had received any texts or calls from her. Jonathan was openly crying by this point. Alexia's family tried to assure him that everything was probably fine. They told him Alexia would probably just show up at the house any minute now, that she was likely just running late. Jonathan wanted to believe them, but this was completely out of character for Alexia. It was not normal for her to be gone for this long without being in touch with anyone. It just didn't make any sense. It was at this point that his brother-in-law, Gregory, reached out and put a comforting hand on Jonathan's shoulder. He just said, "Look, if it makes you feel any better, I'll go back with you. We can go look for Alexia together, or at least we can be together until she comes back. Jonathan didn't really know what to do, but he was very thankful for the offer and said yes, that would be great. A couple of minutes later, the two men got into Gregory's SUV and they began driving back towards their house. But Jonathan had Gregory drive through the streets along the running route that Alexia usually took to see if maybe they could spot her. They drove down all the side streets, scanning for any sign of her. When they reached the edge of town, Jonathan and Gregory got out of the car and started checking the paths that led into the countryside. They also checked the ditches and the banks of the nearby river. But they didn't find Alexia anywhere. Eventually, they just drove back to Jonathan and Alexia's house, hoping that maybe she had finally come home with an explanation for all of this. But she hadn't. At this point, Jonathan was completely beside himself with worry. Gregory, doing his best to stay calm for both of them, suggested that they go to the hospital and see if Alexia had turned up there. A few minutes later, when they stopped in the parking lot of the local hospital, Jonathan jumped out of the car and ran towards the main entrance. Two nurses were standing outside taking a cigarette break. Jonathan rushed up to them and told them that he was looking for his wife, that she had gone on a run 3 hours ago and no one knew where she was now, and maybe, just maybe, she was here. The nurses could clearly see this was an emergency. They put out their cigarettes and went back inside to check the hospital's register. But a minute later, they came back out and told the men that no, and Alexia Duvall had not been admitted that morning. She wasn't there. Before Jonathan or Gregory could protest or ask more questions, the nurses just looked at them and said, "Look, you need to go to the police." Later that afternoon, a police officer named Adeline Pegney sat across from Jonathan in a small room at the Gray police station. He explained to her what had happened, that his wife was missing. Jonathan also gave a description of what Alexia had been wearing when she went out running: bright pink shoes, black leggings, and a red jacket. It would have been pretty easy to spot. And then, after describing her and sort of realizing the full weight of why he was there, he just put his head in his hands and continued to weep, just as he had been doing for much of the morning. Now, Officer Pegney could obviously tell that Jonathan was very upset, but she had to ask the question that was already forming in her mind. So, as delicately as possible, she asked Jonathan if his wife had any suicidal tendencies, or any reason at all she might have run off without telling anybody. Jonathan looked up really quickly and just shook his head, no. He said that overall his wife was a very happy person and was definitely not suicidal. However, as he sat there thinking about it, he added that she had been taking hormones for her fertility treatments, and realistically, those hormones appeared to have affected her really badly. For example, he said that sometimes she would lose control of her emotions entirely and even become violent. In other instances, he said that she would even have memory lapses where she wouldn't even know what she was doing while she was doing it. It was like she had become this completely different person. Officer Pegney nodded and just listened to Jonathan, writing down everything he was saying. When he was done, she followed up and asked, "Can you think of anybody who might have had a problem with Alexia?" For a moment, Jonathan just sat there in silence, kind of mulling over the question. And then suddenly, his eyes went wide, like he had just realized something. He told the officer that they had a neighbor who had been completely obsessed with Alexia earlier that year. He said his name was Arno, and he had been obsessively calling and texting her so many times that Alexia had actually had to block his number. She had even talked about how she was fearful of going out alone because of this neighbor. But just a couple of months earlier, he had been sent to a psychiatric hospital, and because he was literally removed from the neighborhood, the harassment had stopped. But Jonathan said they were kind of worried that at some point he would come back, and then he would be a problem again. And realistically, Jonathan said he could be home now. I just don't know. I don't know where he is. Officer Pegney was obviously very intrigued by this information. So, after this interview with Jonathan was over, she and her investigative team began digging into this Arno guy to see where he was and what was going on with him. And pretty quickly they discovered that while Arno had gone to that psychiatric hospital, that was true. He was not there anymore. He had been released. And so that night, another officer with the Gray Police knocked on the door of Arno's mother's house, where Arno was staying, which was about an hour away from Alexia and Jonathan's house. After the officer knocked, a middle-aged woman answered the door. When the officer asked if she was Arno's mother, she said she was. The officer looked past her, and he could see a disheveled-looking young man sitting right inside. He asked the mother if that was Arno, and again the woman said yes. At this point, the officer asked the mother if he could come inside because he said he needed to speak privately with her son. The mother and Arno in the background both seemed very confused by this, but after a minute they both agreed and the officer came inside. The officer went into the house and sat down in the living room with Arno, while Arno's mother went to the kitchen to give them some privacy. Once the mother was gone, the officer looked at Arno and just said he had some questions about Alexia Duvall. Arno immediately looked down at this question like he was embarrassed and couldn't even look at the officer. But then he looked back up again and told the officer that he had bipolar disorder. He explained that sometimes when he was in a manic state, he acted inappropriately towards women, and that included Alexia. The officer followed up about all those messages that Arno had apparently sent to Alexia that summer. What was going on with that? Arno admitted that he had done that, but he insisted it really was no big deal. He said that he and Alexia knew each other because they had been neighbors at one point and they had also hung out in a group setting once. So him being in touch with her was not totally weird, he claimed. They had a real connection. But Arno clarified that when Alexia told him to stop contacting her, he did. And that was the end of it. But this caught the officer's attention because according to Alexia's husband, Jonathan, the only reason that all the calls and texts had stopped was because Alexia literally had to block Arno's phone number. So, the officer just cut to the chase here and told Arno that Alexia was missing. And then, before Arno could say anything, the officer asked him where he had been that morning at 9 o'clock. And Arno said, I was right here. I was at home with my mom. For a moment, the officer just stared at Arno, trying to read his body language to see if maybe he was being deceptive. So, eventually, the officer just stood up and went into the kitchen where the mother was. And he asked the mother, "Where was your son this morning?" And she told the officer, with a sort of bewildered look on her face, that he was here with her all morning. So at this point, it was clear to the officer that if the mother was telling the truth, it would officially rule out Arno as a suspect because he had a solid alibi. But the officer also knew that, generally speaking, mothers do not make the best alibis. Mothers are known to lie, cheat, and do just about anything to protect their kids. The following afternoon, on Sunday, October 29th, Chief Officer Frank Pettis glanced out his office window as yet another news van sped past outside, down the usually quiet streets of Gray. By now, Alexia's disappearance had blown up into this huge national news story, and this was making it really difficult for Pettis, who was in charge of the investigation. It was still very early in the investigation, but already he and his investigators were being hounded by reporters and camera crews at every single step. Pettis closed his eyes and tried to focus on what his next step should be. The search effort was well underway. They had called in reinforcements from nearby towns and even organized search teams with volunteers from the public. At that very moment, law enforcement was also using drones and dogs to scour the town and all the surrounding woods. Pettis's investigation team had also searched Jonathan and Alexia's home by now, secretly hoping they might find something to pin the disappearance on Jonathan, but there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, and no clues that gave them any direction there. And also, all of Alexia's other family members, her parents, her sister Stephanie, and her brother-in-law Gregory, they could all vouch for each other's whereabouts on the morning of Alexia's disappearance. They all claimed they had been at the house together. And so, without any real leads, Pettis had gotten so desperate for any information that he had literally told his team to set up checkpoints out in the streets and just stop random people and ask them if they had seen or heard anything that could help them find Alexia. And now, as Pettis sat in his office wondering what he was going to do today, he heard a knock at his door. A moment later, one of his investigators entered with fairly surprising news. The checkpoints had actually turned up something. Pettis listened intently as the investigator explained that a number of people he had spoken to had mentioned a van. Now, no one had actually seen the van themselves, but they all appeared to have heard the same rumor. Apparently, there was a man driving around the area in this white van, and he was known to harass girls and women right out on the street. Now, at first glance, Pettis was worried that perhaps this was just an unfounded rumor. But then he remembered there were actually two men in Alexia's family who literally drove white vans. Her father, Jean-Pierre, he owned one. And her husband, Jonathan, he drove one for work. On the afternoon of Monday, October 30th, a little more than 2 days after Alexia went missing, Pettis brought his car to a stop next to a news van that was parked in the middle of the woods, about 4 miles outside of town. Minutes ago, he had received a call from an officer in the field telling him that Alexia's body had been found. And so, Pettis had driven out to the scene as fast as he could. But now that he was here at the crime scene, he could tell that he was late to the game because a news crew was already there, setting up their cameras near a row of police barriers. Pettis was disappointed to see this, because he had hoped that if and when her body was discovered dead, he would have had at least one suspect, or hopefully multiple suspects, identified and under surveillance before the word got out to the general public that Alexia was found dead. But now, he obviously would not get that chance. Pettis climbed out of his car and flashed his badge to an officer who led him around the barriers and into the crime scene. He went over to one of the forensics experts who was taking photos and placing yellow numbered markers on the ground, and Pettis introduced himself as the lead investigator. The expert then led him over to Alexia's body, which was lying on the ground between two tree trunks covered by a white bedsheet. Her pink running shoes were poking out from under the sheet, and Pettis noticed that her feet and the sheet were both partially burned, as if someone had tried to set them on fire at some point. Once the scene had been fully photographed, Pettis bent down and lifted the sheet to get a better look at Alexia's body. She was lying on her back, and there were bruises all over her face. There were also marks on her neck that looked like they were from strangulation. And right away, Pettis noticed a couple of things that were very unusual. First, Alexia's hands were placed neatly in the pockets of her coat, as though her body had been placed there on the ground with a lot of care. Second, despite the beating that Alexia's face had apparently taken, her glasses were placed perfectly on her face, and so to Pettis, it seemed like whoever killed Alexia had felt some sort of remorse afterwards. It was as though the killer had committed this incredibly violent murder, but then had tried to kind of put everything back in order afterward. And this made Pettis think that Alexia's killer was very likely someone who knew Alexia and not a stranger who simply accosted her during a jog. Just then, he heard his name called, and he stood up to take a look. Nearby, there was a forensics tech that was waving him over. So, Pettis walked over, and the tech showed him what he'd found. It was a gray plastic cap that looked like it belonged on some kind of spray can. Pettis thought that maybe this could help explain the strange burn marks on the bedsheet and also on Alexia's shoes. The killer had probably sprayed something on the body to try and help it catch fire, but it didn't work as well as they thought it would. Just then, another forensics tech called Pettis over to them to show him something else. They had found tire tracks in the dirt. Pettis immediately thought about that tip he had been given about this van with a person driving around town harassing women and girls. And he wondered if maybe that was true, that this van was involved, and that these tracks had been left by the killer when they were transporting Alexia's body. So, as this forensics expert began taking photographs of the tire tracks, Pettis made a mental note to examine the tires of every suspect, family member, and other person of interest they came across, just in case one of them was a match. Pettis was about to turn his attention back to the body when he noticed one more unusual thing out in the woods. There was this young man who did not appear to be a reporter, just kind of wandering around out there in the trees, almost lurking near the crime scene. So immediately, Pettis went over to this guy and demanded to know what he was doing there. And at this, the man went completely wide-eyed and just started stuttering, like he was totally caught off guard. Eventually, the guy managed to mumble that he was just out there picking mushrooms. But Pettis could tell he was obviously lying. That was not why he was out there. And so, operating on a gut instinct, Pettis pulled out his handcuffs and placed the man under arrest. Later that same afternoon, just hours after Alexia's body had been discovered in the woods, Pettis sat down at a table at the Gray police station across from this suspicious young man he had just arrested for lurking near the crime scene. And Pettis was pleased. I mean, he had only been in charge of what was now a murder investigation for a couple of hours, and here he was about to speak to a legitimate suspect, really the first suspect who was in custody. But as soon as Pettis actually began speaking to this suspect, he realized that the young man's stutter was not really a sign of him being nervous. He actually had speech issues, and he struggled to speak at all, even when he wasn't nervous. The man was eventually able to explain that his name was Anthony, and he was 29 years old. He said he lived with his parents in Apremont, another small town about 5 miles away. And he admitted that he had lied about being there to pick mushrooms. So, Pettis pressed Anthony to explain why he was really there. And Anthony, he seemed a little embarrassed as he began to explain. But what he said was, he didn't know Alexia personally. He had just heard about her disappearance in the news, and he wanted to help with the search effort. But Anthony said he couldn't read or write, so he hadn't been able to fill out the paperwork to join the official search party. So instead, he had just driven out to the woods in his own car to look for Alexia himself. But while he was out there, the police showed up, and clearly there was something going on. And Anthony said he got scared and just lied, and said he was out there picking mushrooms. He said it was just out of embarrassment. As Pettis sat there listening to the story, he wasn't quite sure what to make of it, or really what to make of Anthony. Anthony's demeanor seemed almost childlike, but his behavior was not childlike. It was very adult-like and pretty suspicious. So Pettis followed up by asking him what he was doing on the morning of October 28th, which was the morning Alexia went missing. Anthony said he had woken up at his parents' house and had breakfast with them before he went out with his girlfriend and also another friend. And he gave Pettis their names and also their phone numbers so they could confirm it. So Pettis stepped out of the room, and he did exactly that. He called the various phone numbers and spoke to the people in Anthony's life, and they all corroborated his alibi. So, despite how suspicious Anthony had been acting, Pettis had no choice but to let him go. A week later, on November 5th, a march was organized in Alexia's honor. 10,000 people turned out to show their support for Alexia's family and also to protest violence against women. Hidden among this huge crowd was a pair of police officers who had been assigned to follow Alexia's husband, Jonathan Duvall. At this point, Jonathan really was looking like the most obvious suspect, since he was the husband and also the last person to see Alexia alive. So, the police had tapped his phone and put him under surveillance. But all they had learned so far from the phone taps was that Jonathan made frequent calls to Alexia's family, to his own siblings and his friends to talk about how much he missed his wife. And the officers who were literally following Jonathan around found that he rarely left his house except to visit Alexia's parents, which he did almost every day. So far, it was like none of Jonathan's behavior actually seemed really suspicious at all. And now, at this big march, the investigators stood in the crowd and watched as Jonathan hobbled his way up the steps to the podium, followed by Alexia's mother and father. In fact, Jonathan was trembling so much by the time he got up there that Alexia's parents had to physically prop him up before he could begin reading his speech to the crowd. And so at this point, the investigators just kind of exchanged a glance. Either they were wasting their time following an obviously grieving husband with nothing to hide, or Jonathan was a world-class actor giving the performance of a lifetime. But the investigators knew that until new evidence presented itself, there was really nothing they could do but watch and wait, which included watching Jonathan and just seeing what he did. They were also still waiting on the tire analysis from the crime scene, but they didn't expect much to come from it. At this point, the creepy white van story seemed to be more like an urban legend in this town. And so, as the weeks turned to months, and still there was no progress on this case, the investigators, including Pettis, began to wonder if this case would ever be solved. But then all of a sudden, new evidence did appear. And when it did, the investigators realized they might have been following the wrong lead this whole time. Because while they had been focused on surveilling Jonathan, a second body had just turned up in the woods outside of Gray. On the evening of Saturday, the 6th of January 2018, Chief Officer Pettis was at his desk, poring over the evidence that had been flooding in all day. The new victim, whose body had been found earlier that same day in the woods, very close to where Alexia's body had been found, was a 38-year-old father of 3. He looked to have died from a gunshot wound to the head. Although, according to the autopsy report, the man had a blood alcohol level of almost 0.4%, which is huge. That can be fatal on its own, or at the very least, knock somebody unconscious. Investigators had found gunpowder on the man's hand, so for now, they were treating his death as a suicide. But the more Pettis looked into the evidence, the less convinced he became that he was looking at a suicide. A gun had been found at the scene, but it had not been located very close to the dead man's body. In fact, the gun was found 130 feet away from the body in a trash can. The only explanation would be that he shot himself, then put the gun in the trash can, and then somehow wandered 130 feet away before collapsing and dying. That was possible, albeit highly unlikely. Being shot in the head is typically immediately incapacitating or lethal, but it is possible he could have shot himself and lived long enough to travel that distance. It just seemed very, very unlikely. So now, Pettis sat back in his chair and just tried to think. It was strange enough to have 2 violent deaths in this same quiet town, let alone to have the bodies be found in basically the exact same spot in the surrounding woods. It just seemed too coincidental not to be looked into. So he had to wonder, maybe there was a connection between this man's death and Alexia's. But later that same month, as Pettis scanned over a document that had just arrived from the crime lab, he wasn't thinking about that second body in the woods anymore. Because this new document in his hands was an expert analysis of those tire tracks that had been found in the woods near Alexia's body. And the analysis showed that there was a tiny defect in the tread of one of the tires. And this defect was so specific that the experts had been able to determine exactly which vehicle left those tracks in the woods. And this vehicle just so happened to be a white van. Pettis felt his pulse quicken as he kept on reading. And a moment later, he reached for his phone and he called his supervisor to tell him the good news. He knew the identity of Alexia's killer. Based on that tire track analysis and also other evidence, including an eventual confession from the killer, this is how police believe Alexia Duvall was killed. The killer was almost blind with rage. They slammed Alexia's head against a nearby wall and then hit her over and over and over again. And then they wrapped their hands around her neck and they squeezed for so long they lost track of time. They were just crushing her neck. And then finally, they couldn't feel her pulse under their fingers anymore. Then, looking down at Alexia's motionless body on the ground, they realized the severity of what they had just done. The killer, in a panic, crouched down next to her and actually tried to wake her up, but it was too late. She was dead. And so, now, they were really panicking. They thought about maybe killing themselves out of guilt, but they were too scared to go through with it. So instead, they hatched a plan to get rid of Alexia's body. The killer very carefully put Alexia's glasses back on her face, and then they lifted her up and they carried her body out to their vehicle. Then they drove out to the woods and dragged her body by the feet to a secluded spot deep in the trees where they hoped nobody would ever find her. They covered Alexia's body in a sheet, and then they sprayed the sheet with this foam that they thought was flammable, hoping that once they lit it on fire, it would help dispose of the body. But when they got their lighter out and held the flame to the sheet, it didn't really work. And so finally, when it was clear they were not going to be able to burn the body here, the killer just left her there and then drove away in their white van, getting home in time to dispose of all the evidence, take a shower, and start the next phase of the cover-up, which was to knock on Alexia's mother's door in a fake panic, asking if anybody had seen her daughter. Because Alexia's killer was her own husband, Jonathan. It turns out Alexia never even went for a run on the morning of October 28th. She was murdered the night before, after she and Jonathan had gotten back from her parents' house. They had gotten into a big fight, which obviously resulted in her death. From the outside, Jonathan and Alexia appeared to be a very happy couple, but in reality, they had been arguing more and more often, primarily because they were not able to have a baby. It was causing a lot of friction in their marriage. And so on the night of October 27th, in the middle of this horrible fight they were having, Jonathan grabbed his keys and tried to leave, but Alexia told him to stop running away from their problems and tried to literally take the keys from him. And according to Jonathan, that's when he just snapped and he killed her. And then he used his work van to dispose of the body. As for that second body that was found in the woods months later, that was determined to be a suicide and completely unrelated to Alexia's death. Jonathan was arrested on the 28th of January 2018. And 2 days after his arrest, he confessed to the murder. At the end of his trial in 2020, he was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.